Hello everyone, today we talk about Crossbowman with pavis from the 15th century. The picture, the model taken in consideration here is from a silver point drawing in John Rous Pageant, dates to the mid-80s of the 15th century. It should represent a French crossbowman engaged in the defense of Caen in 1417. This is not so important because actually there are plenty of images that depict not quite, in fact, this type of combination, but in general, crossbowmen, pavises, and also pavismen. In fact, this video is not dedicated to the pavisier or pavisier, or however you want to call it, depending on the various languages, but properly the crossbowman with pavis in a late medieval siege warfare context, and more specifically actually a 15th century one. This could partly work also from the second half of the 14th century, but today we will talk also a bit about the vocabulary. What do we mean by pavis? I've actually already explained this in videos such as the ones about the medieval shield, about medieval Italian warfare, also recently in the latter case. We will definitely talk about it also for Lithuania, and we will reinforce here essentially the interpretation, sort of categorization problem that we have when we talk about such shields, because also in pop culture we have this sort of meme of the pavis as mostly like a late medieval shield that was somehow used in this sort of camping table movable fashion by individual soldiers, preferably crossbowmen, or at least also archers sometimes, as we will see now, not just in a siege warfare context, but to some extent prevalently, and mostly for this capacity sometimes even of slinging along the back, for example, so that like in some typical move and posture you would picture easily that this guy like crouching, turned with the back to the enemy, covered by this sort of almost Rous, if we were to make an Hellenistic comparison, literally, because it's just like a door, right? And that's the kind of more conventional idea of pavis. And this type of shield actually starts appearing in a better, or if at all, archaeological evidence only from, in fact, this later, mostly in the late 14th century, and iconographically also this is the problem. We see shields that are similar to that, but unfortunately we are not told by a tag or something, look, this is actually what people at the time thought a pavis was, right? And there were other terms, and there are also some misconceptions connected with properly the etymology that also makes things a bit more mysterious as far as we realize when we appreciate not just how they were built, but how in fact the same etymology, the correct etymology at least, explains how actually unspecific the idea of pavis was, at least up to a certain point in history. I worked a bit with the earlier pavises from the 13th century, the very few descriptions that we have of the same. There is all a history. The pavis is more conventionally associated with the Italian one that sort of spread from the 13th to 14th century, very much used by these large infantry armies that existed in the peninsula that we have described at some point. However, the earliest type of pavis, and there is really not much of a connection between the two, apparently, because at least they were surely developed in parallel throughout all of Europe, and also the level of documentation can be tricky for that matter, is in northeastern Europe, Lithuania to be more specific. And the interesting thing is that in the Lithuanian case, the pavis is actually a cavalry shield. It appears like in the, if I'm not wrong, probably the early 13th century. You would wonder, but why, right? And what is there? The problem is, again, reasoning with this obsession for the technological sort of mechanicism, positivism, determinism, pretending that there was this type of shield was a substantially hardcore, sort of precise type of shield, different from any other shield, and so that there was something special about it. How many ways are there to make shields, and what are shields in the first place? Like, there are not so many options at the end of the day. And those cavalry shields, by the way, were also smaller, obviously. The explanation in both cases is easy, actually, and it has to do with missile warfare, right? These shields developed in areas of Europe were exposed to a lot of missile. In the case of Italy, because of the dramatic development of not much just the crossbow technology, but actually the amount and the quality of fielded crossbowmen. And in the case of Lithuania, I think quite easily, the fact that in the 13th century, the quite rude and primitive Lithuanian horseman was actually expanding, as you know, in Ruthenia, and actually battling a big deal against the Mongols, therefore requiring a better protection from the horse archery that they had to cope with. I also made videos about medieval Lithuanian warfare, as I said before, so the Italian one explaining these things, and we will come back specifically on pavisiers in all these contexts, differentiating them for the historical military units series, so that we will be ever more thorough. Now, the point is, what is therefore a pavise, and why do we sort of essentially describe it, categorize it in a way rather than another? So there is the false etymology that was born out of an antiquarian, I think, in the early modern age or the late Middle Ages, regarding Pavia being the origin of this shield, and so this taking the name after the city. Actually, it has nothing to do with that. The etymology of pavise is pavere. It's the Latin word that surely, in fact, came to designate the shield for the very specific function. It's the same etymology of pavement, by the way, that in Latin precisely refers to the idea of, say, thickening, it's like strengthening something by banging it, by essentially hammering it in a way. Now, we know the pavise, as we'll explain now, being constructed in a particular way that was not, in fact, so, say, violent, but if anything, paved. So the idea that there was some sort of compaction deriving from different strata of wood and glues and other, other material, especially from the outer side, that even though we're not explained, like how would actually produce the shield, not much with this name, but how this type of shield would spread, because of course it had to resist penetration from highly performing projectile. This is personally the etymology that I personally came up with publicly, and that I discussed together with others, because some, say, recognize the sort of layered type of construction, but don't really connect it with the idea that this would develop specifically in areas that were more subjected to that kind of missile warfare. Other than this, we do not have actually in the early days a specific type of pavise, say characterized by any other indicator, any other element that you could say, well, that's it. We find big and small pavises. We know, of course, of some, what essentially modern scholarship calls mantlets, to distinguish sometimes from what probably, at least sometimes, were also pavises, to connect it with siege machinery, with this sort of screens, curtains that were created with, say, wooden, in fact, barriers of some kind. The earliest reference that we have to the actual data of a pavise refers to the shields built by the Angevin of Naples for the soldiers of their fleet. And we actually find out these pavises were, for example, fairly small. All right, they had hardly to do, for example, we're not told they were rectangular. Some publications say, well, the pavis was rectangular. Was that really? Because there are very covering, enveloping, concave pavises, for example, and their corners are smoothened. What I actually instead care about the most, instead of trying to categorize something that was likely not categorized, it's just a post-Linnean sort of encyclopedistic fixation, to reflect on why they developed in the areas they did. And so, for example, I identified that crescent that stretches from the Balkans to Eastern Europe as an area, in fact, which historically types of more quadrangular, flat, evidently anti-missile shields used by infantry were sort of more common than other areas in Europe. Why? Because these areas were sort of less stratified socially. In other words, they were less feudalized historically. And there were lots of militias of even just woodsmen, of people like local levies that were regularly, routinely engaging against nomadic horse archers. And as a consequence, they had to develop some designs, including, for example, so the more squared corners, for essentially providing, let's say, being equipped with the most protective shield against the sort of hail of missile that characteristically the nomads poured on them. All right, the reason why Lithuania, in this sense, maybe have to do with the more direct engagement au pair for cavalry. In fact, at also relatively close distance, these guys had to venture into, like, we have explained what Mongol tactics really were, like refusing the center, enveloping with the wings, with lots of, say, side fire. In other countries like Poland or Germany, the solution was apparently also something motivated through the same Poland from the steppes. What in Polish warfare is the so-called Polish belt that you find still in the Polish uprisings in the 19th century, but we find mostly in leather, organic material. In Germany is actually plate armor, right? It's in the eastern Germany, on the frontier with the Mongols and the Slavs, that you actually find in that very period the birth of what would have in a few years become generalized anyway in all the rest of Europe, is this essentially abdominal bands over which single plates of metal armor were attached. That would become the first, not the first plate armor, because technically even, I don't know, a helmet normally is made of plate, or at least something not plain, but still one piece or multiple pieces of hard, like metal, not mail, not other type of protection. But just for saying how that could be an indicator, like it's likely that Lithuania, the Ruthenians basically collapsed at that point and actually accepted the Lithuanians as their rulers. These were instead the ones who actually beat the Mongols, right? And so on horseback, for their very specific type of warfare that at that point was mostly mounted, right? Lithuanian armies at that point become largely mounted, right? Would develop that kind of cavalry pavis. The Italians instead, as we've seen, they had a tremendous missile power, and in probably by volume of fire, we're talking about tens of thousands of quarrels shot in, during even an hour or so on the enemy. And so something terrifying that required this thicker shields, right? In countries where infantry was less performing and or there wasn't a particular amount of specific penetration, or maybe like the enemy just your army would actually fight mostly as mounted, or however with some sort of feudal elite. Like think about the men at arms during the 100 Years' War. Actually, the French and English armies were much more similar than we often recognize. Then you wouldn't have necessarily all that necessity. Now, there is another stage in the development of the pavis that eventually gets finally evidence archaeologically, we have the entire pieces, we are also better documented in general about them, that instead belongs to the second half of the 14th century, and that witnesses, as you know, a specialization of infantry that has shrunk drastically in number compared to previous times, and that basically follows cavalry. And in this role, it's not much, let's say, this latter function that develops the pavis per se, because the pavis is big, apparently, the one that sort of develops later as such. And therefore, we tend to see it mostly in this sort of fortified contexts. I think this year I will write an article exactly on this topic, because we see essentially that pavises, are, especially in the early era, say in the first half of the 14th century, are actually never mentioned in battle, even though we have some pavisiers mentioned. But in the same exact places and times, when you see the when you study siege warfare, we're talking about literally the same armies. All of a sudden, the sources speak of these pavises and pavisiers, even more specifically. So there are lots of hints. It's not entirely clear what say we should point out here, but my explanation is essentially in open field, those infantrymen that used pavises were not exactly specialists. There is a controversy about this, because sometimes we do find in the hiring of a certain amount of soldiers, etc., properly the idea of, okay, a certain amount were pikemen, a certain amount were pavismen, our part were crossbowmen. But the idea is that during the siege warfare, also urban warfare, the pike wouldn't basically be used. I mean, it would be dropped. And so what these guys remained with was the pavis, together with, I don't know, other offensive weapons like warhammers, swords, etc., which would also that also followed the men-at-arms. It weren't technically men-at-arms. The men-at-arms did have pavises sometimes, but also on horseback, but smaller ones. So again, it wasn't much about the size of the shield or even the shape of it that mattered, but how sort of thick this was. And we do have, pavis is notoriously used on horseback, but the latter aspect of look that, these pavises appear mostly in siege warfare could actually be the trait d'union de fil rouge that brings us to the type of troop that we are sort of stereotyping today, and that we do find documented in this time of warfare, that witnesses, first of all, the highest level of armoredness that was ever seen in military history, at least talking, of course, about the soldiers, meaning that really, yes, before and after this, there was less armor around, and the shield in this kind of larger form, also apparently a more encumbered one, mirrors that, together with armies that, as you know, become ever heavier, qualitative, let's say, in interest of numbers, meaning that they weren't the bigger armies in absolute terms numerically of the previous generations, the late 13th to first half of the 14th century, but they were very much heavier, right? And as such, they were being smaller in number. They were also sort of more easily grappled around fortifications and storming ones, right? So there is even an increase in individual skill by the average guy using a pavis over time, because in the earlier times it would have been an average levyman that maybe was even well equipped, like we've seen, especially in the communal armies. There was a lot of material wealth, so the troops would be very well equipped, but it's not like they were real professionals of war. Interestingly enough, however, these pavises, these pavismen, say better, together with crossbowmen, are some of the sort that basically remain around after the shrinking in size of the larger units of the previous period, and so there is mostly a fall in the pike until naturally the Swiss revival in the mid 15th century that really, like, people like to think as if, I don't know, from Courtrai to the Swiss there is a progressive increase of infantry. No, there was a major hole in between, which actually European military culture refeudalized, sort of even came back on horseback to an extent, and in which these fewer infantrymen were, however, more performing, more specialized, etc. And of course, it does take some quality overall to be able to handle a crossbow and a pavise, especially when you start seeing here some sort of heavier equipment for the crossbowman, etc. Like, it's not like this picture actually shows you well that I uploaded like the actual lightness overall of the crossbowman per se. Otherwise, he would have not even properly needed the pavises, right? There are some very heavily armored crossbowmen. I inserted actually like the black and white type of picture here depicting that. Of course, you could have both. You could have a pavisman, heavily armored pavisman, and there would be, especially considering they were also not just the crossbowmen, were sort of assault troops of some kind, as we've seen following the men-at-arms, that were actually the stormtroopers in siege warfare, as they had always been. So there is actually a large debate. It's not really being studied much as a topic in general, and I probably will be publishing something about this relatively soon myself. In any case, it's interesting just to see like the cultural depictions of the same. So when you actually read the sources of this broader era, I would say from the 14th to the early 16th century, and read pavis or pavage, whatever, because there are all the distortions eventually of the original term, you realize that the term, just like any other, is not ultra specifically used. Basically, every sort of kind of more or less large shield used in that sort of also say extensional. You see, the extent can be just like body coverage. It doesn't have to be, again, the camping table fixed on the ground. That's the other thing. Like, original pavises were not created to be fixed on the ground. That would already be throughout all warfare the similar kind of, in fact, mantlets, as we were saying before, more conventionally called, to stress the idea literally of this sort of mantle that was kept in a more or less passive way. But pavis doesn't even begin with that, right? There's no evidence for it. And always remember that, again, in siege warfare, having those kind of fixed protections made more sense, but as we will see now, in open fields, the type of shields that you see are obviously is much smaller, even when they were of the same type. And for obvious reasons, units moved a freaking lot. Like, medieval armies were incredibly well trained, and they performed very complex maneuvers. This is extremely overlooked and also misunderstood to an extent. And especially at this point, you had really like professional, semi-professional standards extended to entire armies that really would have blown your mind. So what's interesting of this illumination from the Pageant, remember we're in the last decades of the 15th century, is the fact that it's interestingly showed in use, right? You have essentially the guy, it's just like in the picture, you have this bar, like, that's actually holding the shield on the ground, and you see that the shield is essentially extending up to the shoulders of the guy, or at least say the shoulders and the lower part of the shoulders, so that he could also raise the crossbow and shoot from behind that. Naturally, this does not provide you with full cover per se, but say in warfare, by collective dynamics, that's not even the single most important thing. Telling the truth, we see sometimes also archers provided with these. There is a bit of an iconography, at least in modern times, depicting, for example, the English longbowman in front of this sort of, again, fixed on the ground kind of barriers in open field. That's actually not very realistic, unless we're talking about really like some proper fortifications. At that point, ditches and palisades would have been more typical. You could have this sort of battlement as well. Consider that everything was fortified to a degree that we often misunderstand. Like camps were often built like entire castles, and literally towering at the same level of the enemy. For example, cities or castle battlements. And we have sort of lost there even the sense of how, for example, well protected someone behind that could really be. Then naturally there would be some sort of more improvised means to, in fact, move, for example, these pavises, how they're showed at the very end of the Middle Ages. So it's not something, again, typical for what we call the pavis. At least for what was the pavis at the time. We would call the pavis is actually this, but it's not necessarily correspond mirroring that, as we were saying before. One reason why the archers would have made apparently less use of the pavis is also the fact that they were a much more dynamic kind of troop. The crossbow took more time to reload, but it was also more performing. So, telling the truth, like people still have problems with this, but the vexata question of longbow versus crossbow, again, we'll talk about this in another occasion. There wasn't actually much of a difference, especially considering simply the numbers, the disparities. It's not the single weapon that made any particular difference, for that matter. And so you can imagine in open field, say, like even a field aid to hold this fixed pavis being sort of useless. We have found there are examples of this, like the average guy that holds somebody else's shield, especially a missile soldier that shoots from behind that, and there's literally a guy that just repositions the shield for this shooter. We've seen it even in Assyrian art, for example. There it's very well neatly depicted, but we don't understand exactly how it worked. First of all, that's a very different context. You would have archers sometimes being veritable noblemen, having this sort of, in fact, field aids on a regular basis. As you understand, however, there are lots of impracticalities, especially in the Middle Ages. You wouldn't have this. As we said before, it would be rather the man-at-arms who was followed by pavisiers to some degree, and so this idea of shifting the shield because it was too heavy, like maybe in a siege warfare context, yes, there were people who were deputed to shift the shields, to arrange them, to create a court and something. But the notion that there would be, say, tactically intensive sort of, say, cooperation dynamic between a couple of soldiers just for one guy holding the shield and the crossbow and being out there, it's just against a bit military logic. Just if you consider especially open engagements, the dynamism of the same. Like if it is a static type of warfare, you don't really need this duo acting in tandem in combat necessarily. It's still like, where does the guy, for example, without shield, that is also the more important, because the other would be just like a field aid of some sort, protect himself. It's the shield that would do it. And in open field even less. I mean, in open field, the important of these troops is being numerous. And so what do? I don't know, you have 800 crossbowmen, you have 800 people as field aids that in the midst of combat, like, provide with, it's like the shifting of the shield, right? It creates just confusion, disorder. It's just doesn't make any sense, right? But somehow we have interiorized in pop culture that even that idea, not too much, I would say. And again, there are instances of these second men doing that maneuver, but it was likely much less of a complex thing that we think arranged. But anyway, there were all kind of exceptions and even bizarre solutions. For example, there is a manuscript dating to the beginning of the 15th century that represents two of the heavy-duty type normally used in siege work. We have one made of iron, right? Or else, of course, like thick wood faced with iron. This was an actual thing. There were shields historically that were laminated frontally to add protection. This tells you how heavy, like in this case, the pavis could really be. As we were saying before, however, the average pavis would have been constructed of wooden slats glued together and faced with painted or varnished hide, usually taking the form of coats of arms or badges of their town or lord, and often in the form of an escutcheon that, as you know, was actually like the shape of the shield in general that varied over time. At this time, like 15th century, is especially like for example, the boucher one, the so-called German or Dutch style, which has sort of a hole in the side. There was at this time it was the square variant that has square top and rounded base, less frequently. In any case, again, there were, as you understand, different shapes involved. There would be wood or steel props, as we've seen, and this lit metal grille for additional protection and, in fact, capacity of seeing in front of the shield, through the shield. And this, of course, especially for missile troops, was particularly relevant because the tempo of siege operations was, in many ways, at least during the assault, it was intense, but throughout most of the harassment, like this long, tiring sieges, like you would imagine a lot of sniping from both sides and, waiting the right moment to get to lower the guard, spying on each other. It becomes really a very heavy psychological work, and in order to ease it, like there is this further security in they allowing essentially a gap, a slit of some sort, which typically like this, that the missile weapons wouldn't aim for. Surely somebody got an arrow in the eye because of that, but it was rare, and it was, as we've seen, it was normal actually to expose oneself to projectiles anyway, as we see even from literally this guy, as we were saying before in the picture, that say in order just to shoot would have exposed himself on a regular basis. So that was not sort of a less was actually less daring, but for an attack, for surprising the enemy in ways that could be very, very effective. Then of course we have other information about pavises. We will talk about them in other circumstances. There is a beautiful illumination from the Grand Chronique, dating to the 70s of the 14th century. This is the Grand Chronicles of France, and this is the scene in which Etienne Marcel, the leader, the Parisian bourgeoisie essentially, insurrected, and there is a 14th century Parisian militiaman who would have been also well equipped, of course, and aside from the rest of the armament, we will see perhaps in a dedicated video, we can see a rectangular shield, so pavé, hence pavise, like as the type of troop deriving from the name, which is relevant because infantry shields of this type normally appear only in pictures of sieges, and instead you see actually a much more sort of a guy using this in combat, right? We're told this was not really typical for mid to late 14th century. We also have less evidence in general, but it shows you that, of course, some larger shields, aside from artistic licenses, could be used more dynamically as well. And so there wouldn't be much of an emphasis on the heavier type, but on something that you could use more dynamically, of course. There is an ordinance of 1351 specifying the French pavis equipment as a coat of plates, habergeon, bassinet with camail, gorget, arm harness, gauntlets, sword, couteau, lance, and pavé. This is a very heavy guy. This is the type that we're describing before as essentially semi-professional, professional, at least properly employed to support heavily men-at-arms. And these troops are described in action by Froissart in the engagement at Nogent-sur-Seine. In fact, just 8 years later, the ordinance, where 900 French infantry armed with lances and large shields, quote, were so strong the arrows made no impression on them, so that this French infantry advanced on it and broke through a line of English archers, putting them to flight. This is a very important evidence because, first of all, here we're not talking uniquely just of missile troops. Actually, the ordinance describes a spearman fundamentally. And we see how compact and tough, of course, like heavy infantry really was, and how effective the pavis really was, also against the English archers. Like, so, of course, there will be the genius who ask, but then why then didn't the French use, this pavises to advance against the English, and so they could beat them? That's not how the art of war works, right? I will not digress again on how the tactics of the 100 Years' War functioned, but this is the point. Heavy troops always defeat missile ones, right? What you see there is combined tactics. It's another thing. You need the heavies against the heavies, supported by the lights, and there isn't actually much of an evidence that the longbowmen per se were, again, particularly more performing than other missile troops. This is a myth that has been developed, like, for sort of obvious reasons, in a bit of a positivistic way, just because the English army was so performing. So it had to be about the longbows. No, right? It wasn't about the longbows. It was also about the longbows, but not because of the weapon, or because of those who used them, who they were, what was their background, etc. And there is no evidence whatsoever that tells us that in the 100 Years' War the English had an advantage because they used the longbow. Zero, right? There's not even a source that says this, right? And even when the missile troops managed to score a lot of hits and being very effective, etc., it's not outside of a combined armed tactics and lots of other things that unfortunately are not documented. I don't think that we actually understand very clearly what happened, even during the major battles of the 100 Years' War, for us to pretend that it's all about them, right? It's just a very weak, say, an indicator of a very weak approach to military history in general, poor strategic background. In any case, again, I love personally the English armies of the 100 Years' War. I, of course, strongly appreciate the French ones as well, but the reasons of the English victories in the main engagements of the 100 Years' War, at least, are in fact due to England, right? Not much to the longbows per se. And again, I explained this in other videos, but I will not digress on it yet again. We'll get to the English longbow. I made a video about actually this very topic, about the medieval bow and the longbow in English tactics, etc. But for example, a good military historical units about English archers, there were different types, by the way. It would be quite interesting. Just as, I don't know, the Scottish Guards at this point in the service of France, right? There are lots of analogies as well. The French developed their own archers as well at the point, and you have to appreciate also their crossbows. In any case, as we see here, even heavy infantry alone could beat the longbows. There is actually a few evidence, as we were saying before, of pavises being actually used on the battlefield. We see lighter ones, and there is an exception from the Wars of the Roses, and specifically the the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461. There is an anecdote, probably, about the Earl of Warwick intending to fight from this carefully planned defensive position, having dozens of long nails driven through his longbowmen, pavises, right? So, of course, as we said before, archers could use this type of shield too, with the intention that once these troops had exhausted their arrows, they could actually lay the pavises flat, and providing with the nails sticking out on the other side a barrier of veritable caltrops against the Lancastrian attack. How much this would actually be a thing, I don't know. Why not using caltrops in the first place? But it gives you an idea of how, let's say, every type of equipment could be used even in unorthodox, ad hoc, sort of ingenious ways that, however, wouldn't go too very far, let's say, compared to the original use of the weapon, nor having this dramatic effect on the entirety of the battle. And so one has always to consider what, say, everything is, then why not using, again, caltrops, and or, you know, why wouldn't the Lancastrians avoid the nails, for that matter, especially if they had some nice, you know, armored feet of some sort. But let's say, aside from this is not the point, at least that was for the men-at-arms, but it's just like an indicator what the role could really be in open field, because we have to accept that we don't know much else about this. And again, I'm studying this. I can already tell you that there is actually no way of actually finding out. If anything, it's just posing the problem and trying to find an adequate explanation. My one, again, is that probably pavises were, especially in the earlier days, we've seen, were even smaller than we think usually for the very infantry. Would have been actually the most common type of shield, especially for the front ranks. And so, as we have seen, we have read it from the French ordinance, for example, of 1351. Lancers had to be equipped like that, right? And we get it from many other sources, because especially the dispositive ones contemplating what kind of equipment these troops had to go on campaign, at least with, are very clear. The point is that that's the difficult thing, and that's the one I studied, is that we do not get from battle accounts that they are the only literal source from which we can understand what actually happened in combat. There is no other. These others are just accessory, really. We do not get it, right? So my best take is actually that while some types of troops would have been, because why couldn't the pavis men, for example, be just a lancer? We see it even from these ordinances. We see it from the iconography, whichever like these shields were, generally speaking, the idea of having this heavily defended and often also armored melee soldier. We've seen it in the frescoes from Como and Sabbionara. In the 40s of the 14th century, we've seen it in the video about Italian warfare recently, are always there, right? So these troops were evidently melee fighters. They're depicted like that, sometimes even with pikes. So it's kind of obvious that a large shield would have been slung, for example, on the shoulder of a pikeman that would even rest maybe on his knees, like with the pike fixed on the ground and his, say, more outer frontal part protected by the shield. We see it. It's logical. It's kind of obvious. The pavis developing mostly because of the the defense it can provide against missile penetration. At this point starts becoming really with the most advanced type of crossbow is really impressive. Not that before that wasn't the case. Actually, shields had like from quite a while like sort of assumed that function, but here it's sort of further specialized, just like the crossbows had. Like you see how they always went in parallel. You can't really see what came first and what came later. But what, in this sense, like the pavisman would be deployed like, as opposed to the pikeman, there's not big even as an explanation. It's a bit like, I don't know, in ancient Greece when you're told that there was a unit that is named after the shield, typically because the Greeks almost always did that. But you see them employed in different ways, maybe as commandos, as melee troops, as pikemen, and it changes. So we don't have to be that sort of... there is obviously some concrete functionality in the tactical specialization and the way these troops have been normally employed, but unfortunately we just do not know, right? We do not have the types of sources and in the right amount for us to clearly understand how such arguments work. It's a big question mark. You have to use military logic, say analogy with all the risks involved, and just being always open to every possibility and sort of making sense of things. There are military historians who study battles without even considering how much space a unit would take on a battlefield, and there is, let's say, always some sort of scarcity, as far as I'm aware from my work, regarding probably the care for strictly tactical reconstructions, and in part it derives exactly from the fact that it's difficult. You should write only about tactics, which is what I do. Instead, people sell books because it's the battle, and then they tell you some sort of adulterated story, but they don't even reconstruct the actual battle. It's weird. A critical analysis of the sources in order to reconstruct how combat really unfolded in that particular circumstance. And so you have very strange, bizarre ideas. And the worst about this is that people read these works and they think that they're not showed the coherence, right? They're not showed like the logic, the reason behind analysis. It's just like a story, right? And you understand that too. I mean, there are lots of people. We all started in a sense like that. And so it's important for these publications to exist. But when you understand that there is nothing beyond this, and that tactical reconstruction is, I don't know, for example, De Vries, that was his PhD thesis eventually published, the one about the battles of the infantry battles of the victories, actually, of the 14th century, first half of the 14th century. It's a terrible example of method, right? It's actually very bad. De Vries also recently wrote for Osprey some years ago now, with admittedly other authors, but say in battles that are not reconstructed or poorly explained. Why is that? De Vries is like just a myth within the environment. Oh my god, it's so cool, it's medieval warfare where the guys who studied it. Have you actually even looked at if your battle reconstruction makes sense? It takes a lot of time to work well. Unfortunately, that's always it's beautiful to work, and that's in fact the entire experience, but that rewards you in a way. But you understand, very often people don't care. And even those who care eventually find themselves in front of problems that they must be able to solve, but adequately. Just to make an example, when I write an article about this topic, it's never like there is the solution to, like, the 100% sort of solution of the issue. Unfortunately, it's practically never like that. And it often gets down just to, hypothesis, more or less plausible. It's mostly just like crossing out all what seems implausible and is not comforted by the data, by the evidence. That's always, of course, how it should be. And then, however, never having like the full picture, the full realization of how it really went. Unfortunately, that's the ABC of history. Like, nobody can legitimately say, oh, okay, well, the thing literally went like that. We need multi-years trials even to understand how single accidents between two people happen. Right? You can imagine things that happened 700 years ago with tens of thousands of men involved and with very scarce amount of evidence overall that is also often contradictory and or in fact unreliable. The background of the sources is crucial as well. You can't just pick evidence from the sources as if you were shopping in a supermarket. You must always be conscientious and accurate. You don't really have to, and that's also very important, you have to test your own theory. You have to put it under pressure within the same articles. I don't know why I started talking about this. The actual reason is that I just watched for how long I have recorded, and it's too few. I want to reach the hour, but I will enrich the video with this because seriously, I'm thinking about writing exactly about this topic. But you have to test your own theory, meaning that, again, because by publishing it, you're exposing yourself to any possible kind of criticism. And very often, the peer reviews are completely useless as far as that is concerned, because you find a guy who says, okay, this article is great, he talks about this and that, pass it. Another says, okay, this passes, but I don't like how he wrote this, and maybe he didn't even understand what you wrote. But the only person who actually knows the fullest, especially in this very analytical works, what you have done and what the problems are, is you, right? And especially when you're very clear about what you're doing, like making a tactical analysis of a battle, for example, and somebody comes to you and says, maybe you have been doing this for years, somebody comes to you and says, I don't know, I have never received terrible criticism, but, statements like, I don't know, we can't take the source as reliable because it's just a chronicle. And aside from the fact that I work only with chronicles, because those are the only sources to tell you how battles went. But the question is, what are we even talking about? These are the sources that we find. Of course, you should understand that they may not be truthful, but to what degree? Like, if we have only this, and if what they say sort of makes sense and it's contextual, and essentially also the sources are in agreement with one another, especially in my context, the one in which I work. But there is envy sometimes. There is this thing of, this guy is writing, he's bold, he's young. I'll try to pretend that he's not playing, say, with the right rules, and so he's. But then they can't also do anything, because when you have actually created a bulletproof article where you said literally everything could be said about that encounter, you put your own theory under pressure, and very often find out that it's exactly doing that makes it bulletproof. It's a great satisfaction, right? It really helps people understand better also what these events really were. And other advice, always remember that the more you dig into something and the newer things come out, like hardly in even, I don't know, a bunch of sources there is something that you hear that there is nothing that you have left to contemplate. There is always something you can say. There is always a vision, a perspective, an idea that something. The worst, of course, is when you forget there was an important source about the topic you didn't use, but that we will hopefully avoid. But let's say there is always like a distance of years, lots of issues that when you work especially on the same topic, make you reflect on how, to an extent, you're the person who knows the most about that, and let's say you're a bit. It feels lonely out there, right? I've always appreciated solitude for that matter. I don't have a problem in that sense, but when you realize that what you're saying is truly understood just by you, in the sense that others don't really care about it or study something else, they're busy, and you really work very hard, and at the end of the day what the other people want for you is just to publish, and hardly many people will read what you wrote, then it does feel lonely. It does feel like even among peers, even among experts in fields that may seem, say for example, the same era, the same context, you're actually still digging niches that are incredibly distant from one another. Say, because the more you dig, and the vaster the world that you find is, and so like the other person doesn't have quite a notion of that, and they tend to be, as I was saying before, also dismissive and or like oh no, I don't think so. I've one very strange thing that I found sometimes, especially at during conferences that aren't like with paper in hands normally, meaning that you normally talk with, again, who is listening, with experts hopefully. There is some sort of attitude never met. Like, to me, again, backing my points is very important methodologically. And sometimes I'm found by great experts saying, no, this is not it. Right? And not really providing an answer to that. What's the answer? Oh, no, it's not like that. And they not even say, they don't even tell you, I'll do this, it will work, or no, it's just like, to me, that's not a thing. But I don't know. I don't tell you even why that's the case. It's happened to me multiple occasions. Sometimes they really don't give you even any hint about it. You realize that probably they are sort of bluffing to an extent. Without mentioning that I've often corrected some of my correctors that didn't know, that acted a bit as if they knew something that they really didn't, and unfortunately for them, they messed up with the wrong guy. Because I'm very confrontational, actually, and I have a great if again, I also accept criticism pretty well. The problem is that I don't accept criticism that is wrong, and that is also impolite sometimes. Like, you can even be right. I remember this, if anything, happened to me only during, I think, exams when I was a student. But like, even if you screw up, like, there are ways and ways of being treated, right? Sometimes you had some professors provoked you heavily too, and that's something also that always struck me, like, meaning, like, what it can be straining, can be motivating, but I also was one of those students who stood up against professors, and I risked multiple occasions, both at school and at university, of being expelled, because I was actually a good student. Partially, the thing didn't happen because of that, but I really know how to test people's boundaries, and that's sort of a, I don't know whether unpleasant part of me, but with authority, like, I'm always wondering, like, my objective is rising to the top, but from behind the scenes. it's a when I'm at the top actually starting to beat hard and epurating, and that's the kind of thing that I'm always after. And in my publications I have this though. For example, the last one last article I wrote, I really really roasted a lot of scholars, including a name that I made before, and otherwise, where's the fun in it? Let's be honest. Very well, I think we surpassed an hour with my anecdotes, but in general, like the topic of pavises, this may be the first video dedicated specifically to pavismen, but it surely won't be the last, right? As I mentioned before, because this type of specialty was out there, we must understand much better. It's a bit probably the most mysterious of all. We understand what pikemen did, we understand what crossbowmen did, what pavismen and pavises did in a broader sense, like who used the actual weapon and who say specialized in the sense that he was a pavisman accordingly is not entirely clear at all. And again, all the myths that it was this guys that just moved this sort of mantlet fixed on the ground, or it's just, I don't know, it's that shape, the shield, that size. These are all cliches that do not actually find much evidence, and or at least even when they do, of course, in these various roles, in fact, reveal how sort of more complex the thing really was. And unfortunately, we don't have the full certainty again on this. Plus, just the art sometimes is beautiful to contemplate, because it sort of makes you understand through their eyes what really mattered, even representing them, right? And there's a bit of this darker vibe that we have gotten from the 15th century, and there's something to it. Others seen the century a bit more splendid, but really there were lots of much greater difficulties in understanding how it actually was than we normally think. Of course, today we didn't concentrate much on arms and armor because the point was not talking about the crossbowman per se, or even siege warfare per se. There could be some sort of speculations on how, for example, this positional type of pavis would have been employed. We more or less said it before, like the interaction again with the enemy as well is likely less, again, very fluid, very mobile in ways that we don't even need to specifically address. But I remember when I started this, especially my PhD, I was postulating the possibility of this shield being again used by pairs, as we were saying before, but I realized it sort of didn't make much sense, not even in a siege warfare situation. Who does cover what? The first thing was saying maybe the pavisier. We'll get it because this video is not about the pavisiers as such, right? That's, as we've seen, another thing. But the concept being, the pavisier is just a guy that moves the shield to protect the crossbowman during his movements. Are we sure? Actually, the pavisier, as we've seen, is just also a guy using a pavis and being, say, a pikeman, for example, like the ones that sort of chased away the longbowmen. And again, the figure of this guy simply moving the shield in a specifically tactical functionality, like move here, move there, taking cover, it's not there. Doesn't find sense. So it's the idea, to some extent, of let's suppress a particular area of the fortification by approaching with this guy with a shield covering the crossbowman. In that case, actually, the crossbowmen, as we've seen, could have done it all by themselves with these movable shields, and in a sort of military context, that even had they simply had to move fast, would have likely done it under fire, and therefore not really requiring a guy simply holding the shield. It would be incredibly clumsy. If you think about that, it would have, even if you look at the sizes, like from this picture from the manuscript, for example, you realize that like this shield is made perfectly for a single guy, right? And a heavier one capable of covering implicitly both guys is not really to be found, if not in a static position that at that point does not really have like it has a tactical function, but let's say guys that interact around this place and at that point not moving the shield, so just covering behind that, so and doing different things or maybe the same thing, because Wu did stay during an assault behind these things. Like normally assaults, in fact that's what I wanted to point out, were launched altogether, say with all troops, unless there was a breach of some sort, like around the entire perimeter, right? There could be, of course, fortifications were heavily bombarded, etc. But if these were, there are different operational styles, different strategic goals as well. And I studied some episodes in the 20s of the 14th century, which are very fast, good. Sometimes they're coups, actually, and so at other times they are actual sieges, assaults to fortifications of castles in open ground, where literally, like as it normally was the case, the besiegers were many more than the garrison. And in order to achieve the greater result, they would basically deploy all around the castle and would attack from all sides. And that seems to have been really the norm for that matter, so that we also tend to see things too much in a sort of individualistic Call of Duty thing, that we always heavily underestimate the collective harmony of these troops, like how habitually how say uniformly they were habituated to operate, right? Likely, like for all the different contexts. Of course, here we're talking about even 2 centuries of history. Things change, but say in a given moment, more or less, how a castle is stormed is something that sort of everybody knows, not just within the same army, but in any other army around, in the same way. There's no surprise. The operations, the actions are so smoothly carried out. Even in the times, you realize you can calculate that. You understand how habitual it was to fight, and therefore also how habitual it was to actually perform this stuff together in ways that they knew and they didn't even deem say relevant to describe, because everybody knew that, and that in fact we wouldn't learn because we aren't there, we haven't done it, we can't reconstruct that in any positively or even heuristically effective way. So the question is, what the hell are we talking about, right? What kind of sort of we have to be honest with ourselves, as I said before, and we have to definitely be in a condition to recognize our limits, as always, and if anything, starting from those, because it's not much about our limits, but how much you can search within that escapes the average person's attitude, and that's pretty much it. But also, again, we'll talk about crossbow, and we'll talk about 15th century siege warfare. I actually already made multiple videos on this topic, so this will blend in nicely. for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.